Hello and welcome to First Flight, a Star Trek Enterprise rewatch podcast where we are watching and discussing each episode of Enterprise in succession. First Flight is a proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions Network.
This is Commander Tucker of Enterprise. We've got some information you're going to want to hear.
Welcome, Enterprise fans. I'm your co-host, Abby, and tonight, to discuss the episode Desert Crossing, I am beyond thrilled to have a guest co-host, Kerry. You might remember hearing Kerry's feedback on a few of our previous episodes, and though Melanie can't be with us this week, Kerry is another Enterprise fan who is excited to discuss the episode with me here today. So welcome, Kerry. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you so much, Abby. I'm thrilled to be here.
All right, so let's jump into this. Desert Crossing's teleplay was by Andre Bormanis, and the story was by Rick Berman and Brannon Braga and Andre Bormanis. It was directed by David Straighten. It aired on May 8th, 2002. But before we begin our discussion, we need to issue a read alert.
Tactical alert. All hands to stations.
There are potential spoilers ahead, and we might end up talking about any part of the series at any time, so you've been warned. And here is time for my captain's log and summary of the episode.
Captain Starlog Supplemental.
All right, summary of Desert Crossing. After helping an alien whose ship is in distress, Archer and Trip join him on his planet, where they find themselves suddenly involved in a planet-wide conflict. All right. Time to deploy our subspace amplifiers and get into this episode. Kerry, let's go.
So we'll start with a cold open where we see Archer. He's in his quarters doing a log and talking about going to Risa and reading books, and Porthos is there. I love Porthos so much. Anytime Porthos is in an episode, like we were talking before we started recording, it just makes the episode so much, just adds extra joy to it. It's so wonderful. So he's doing his log and kind of talking to Porthos at the same time. And then there's a distress signal, and then he has to go answer it. And turns out he's not going to be going to Risa after all. So yeah, that was a fun cold open. But it's interesting. You really don't, sometimes with some cold opens, you kind of get an idea of what's going to happen right away. And with this one, it's kind of a mystery. You don't know what he's going to find on the ship that's sent the distress signal.
But classic Star Trek there of answering a distress call and going into things blind. I mean, how many times have they done that? So nice to see that little nod.
Yes, absolutely.
And then Zabral is on the ship, and whoo, that's a guest star right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's got the person who played him, was it Clancy Brown? Was that
Clancy Brown, yes.
Big personality. And you know who he reminded me of was Andre the Giant. The character kind of reminded me of like a 1980s wrestler with the rough voice, kind of like this. And he really reminded me of Andre the Giant. Big personality. I thought he played the role very well.
He reminded me a lot right away, and I know you'll appreciate this, Kerry, being a Muppet fan like I am, of the Count from Sesame Street with the deep voice and his cadence, and he kind of presents himself very regally, even though he's not always in a regal situation. And so that's where my vibe went. And he never comes across as mean or scary or rude, or even when he's fighting, he's still very warm. And that's why I kind of got that Count vibe off of him.
I see that now. Yeah. And I'm trying to imagine the Count saying like, I'm very easily offended.
Exactly. Exactly. That is one offense you have given. 2 offenses you have given.
Yeah. That was really the only thing I didn't like about the character was I am offended easily. Like you're kind of bullying Archer into coming to see you. And obviously there was a reason he was doing that, and we'll talk about that. But I don't know. I find it annoying when people do that. When you say, no, I don't want to come. And they're like, oh, well, I'm going to be offended if you don't. And
yeah.
So that was a little annoying, but I understand like they had to have him do that to make the episode work.
Well, and one of the things that I liked about Zabral right away, too, is that, yes, he was very insistent, we'll say, but he was also very polite and very grateful. And I mean, you find out later that, yes, there was an ulterior motive here, but I do believe that that is who he is. He wants to give his best to these people. He wants to present himself well. He is gracious, and he's looking out for the bigger good and appreciative of those around him that are helping him out. So even though he is kind of ambiguously morally gray in this episode, I do think that his big heart comes through all the way from the beginning, even if he's going to be easily offended because his heart is so big.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think he does have a big heart. And yeah, I think that's very well put.
And his costume. I mean, you know, I'm a costume nerd, but the costumes are very neat and very subtle. And the intricacies, if you looked at like the stitching, the embroidery, the embellishments, they are really beautiful costumes and they look comfortable.
Yes, I agree. They do look comfortable. And I like costumes too. And yeah, like, and for me, the capes I thought that he had, those were really interesting.
Yes. I'm always a fan of a good cape.
Oh yeah. Gotta have a good cape.
Adds a lot of drama.
Yes. When you see a character in a cape, you know, you've got some good drama coming.
So let's move on to where we've met Zobral. They've accepted the invitation. Let's talk a little bit about how Archer convinces Trip to come with him. And when they first get down to the planet and have that meal with Zobral. What were your feelings on that one, Kerry?
Well, I thought it was kind of funny because Archer kind of did to Trip what Zobral did to him.
Yeah.
Because Trip didn't want to go. Trip doesn't like deserts. He doesn't like the heat. And Archer's like, come on, you should come. You'll enjoy it. And finally, he talks him into it. But I thought that was amusing that he was kind of doing the same thing to Trip that Zobral did.
Yeah, he even threw Malcolm out there. I'll ask Malcolm instead.
Yeah. Like, nobody really wants to go down there, but you're all trying to convince each other. So that was that. Yeah.
To Paul, the Vulcan, who grows up on a desert planet, they didn't ever think to ask her to go. I mean, she wouldn't probably really have an issue there, but that probably weaves into something that we'll talk about in a little bit. So,
yeah.
But I have to say that as much as Archer is pressuring Trip, I do appreciate, and this is really where it starts in this episode, and it continues all the way through, that we get a really nice slice of the Archer and Trip relationship, which we've seen bits of, but this one, it really comes into focus, and we see it as captain and commander. We see it as pals. We see it as the old friends, and we see it in the way that they are almost at this point like siblings, because they can needle at each other, but it's done with love behind it, and they know exactly when they've pushed each other to the stopping points and they need to back off or they need to change. And that's just a nice through line throughout this whole episode, is that development.
I completely agree. And I think we see that here too. And it was interesting to hear them talking about the survival training they did in Australia. That was kind of cool to hear that story too.
Yeah. And that the snake meat is a joke throughout the whole thing too.
Yes.
I have never personally had snake meat, but after this, I definitely don't think it's high on my list to try.
Yeah, same.
But their dinner, and okay, so Enterprise is about the food, and we know this, and we love this, but this dinner, like, first of all, I think it looked delicious. It had all the different soups and the rices and the stews and the funky looking produce, and I really appreciated that they didn't use utensils, and I think that's a very nice touch that just makes this definitely feel like a different culture. There's no knives and forks and spoons. Everything is finger food. Even the soup has bread that you're dipping in and using like the utensil. And that's just a nice little touch. Maybe that was just the props department going, oh my God, if we have to have a table full of food, we're not adding more. But I thought that was a nice way for them to really get into that food. And I appreciated the fact too, that even though they were eating some interesting things, they tried a bite of everything. That is true exploration of the palate as well as exploration of the stars.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting to see them trying the different food willingly. You know, and some of it they were like, oh, we don't know about this, but they tried it anyway. And it's like that when you go to another culture. You might try food that you wouldn't normally eat, and you might be skeptical, and maybe you'll like it, and maybe you won't. But I like seeing in any Star Trek, I like seeing the characters sampling cuisines from other races, from other planets. It's really cool. So I liked seeing that. And I didn't catch the no utensils thing, but yeah, you're right. And that's really cool.
Well, and I think this might be the perfect part to bring in, that they were eating the essence of the male, which is one of the best phrases in this one. And like we said, they tried it and tasted it. But this was the first point when I started my rewatches for this podcast where I went, hey, wait a minute. The people serving them are his men.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. There's no women. Now, I would think this might be a culture where the women would prepare the food and serve the food. And that's where I started watching and realizing besides Hoshi and T'Pol, there's not a single other female in this episode. And I think once I noticed that, and I'm not saying that it's something that can't be done, but once I noticed that, it kind of bugged at me. And it made me really wonder where in this society, either in the cities or with these rebels, where are the women? I mean, if they're getting bombed, they're not hanging out in the basement. Maybe they're a society and a species that has no women. I mean, we don't know that, but I think it would have been something, even a throwaway line would have made a big difference. And having seen in the past few episodes where we've had really strong moments with our main women characters and supporting and guest star women characters, this felt a little lacking there for me. And it niggled at me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I hadn't considered that until you brought it up, but you're right. I mean, it is you don't see a lot of women. You don't see any women in their culture. So we do see a lot of T'Pol talking to I think it was the Chancellor from the planet, who we'll talk about more soon. So we see her a lot interacting with him, but there's not a lot of women in this episode. You're absolutely right. And the essence of the male, that part, I thought that part, there's one part I thought was quite amusing so he said that, and Archer and Trip are very clearly skeptical. They're not liking this, and they eat it, and it's very clear that they're very uncomfortable. And Archer just starts looking all around. He's like, "Oh, hey, nice tapestry." I thought it was so funny how you know when you're visiting people and you're uncomfortable and you're like, "Okay, hey, nice picture," So I thought that was funny. It's relatable. We've all been there.
Yeah, it is. And I think that this flows into the game that they go into then next. And, the alien lacrosse. And I think it's interesting too, because this again it's a very, very masculine game. And not that we couldn't have had women in there. Women play games very similar to this in real life, but there just aren't any. And, the shirts are off and they're sweaty and they're knocking each other. And it was very interesting because as that transfers then into them asking later on for help, it just feels very like, we've shown you we're tough and you ate all this and we fortified you and now we're ready to go and have battle. Yeah, it seems very alien to me that would be the way you would go about it.
That's true. That's a very good point. When I watched that scene, it reminded me of the volleyball scene in Top Gun. So yeah, I agree. I agree with everything you said. I thought it was interesting. I don't know if it was then or later, but like you could actually see, it was the first time I had ever seen a Star Trek episode where you could see the characters were sweating.
Yeah. Yes.
Which I don't know what soundstage they filmed that on. If it was on Planet Hell, then they probably were sweating.
Yes.
So maybe they weren't really faking it, but I thought it was kind of cool that they actually showed that. You don't usually see the characters, with soaking armpits. So yeah, good on whoever decided to do that. I mean, because you're going to do that in the desert. You're going to sweat. It's hot.
Yeah. And I also thought to myself, while they're doing that, it's interesting that they took their shirts off because everybody else didn't. I mean, this isn't like this was a shirtless game. Were they really that hot? Are they? Mm-hmm. I know that this was a UPN thing. They were in decon just as much. So I understand the production reason for it. But the in-universe one, the mom in me is going, did they put sunscreen on before they started this? I mean, did they put sunscreen on under their shirts? Because they're going to be blistered.
Oh my gosh. I was thinking about that the whole time. I'm like, it's not a big deal, but I'm like, they should have been so much more sunburned by the end of the timeout. Like they should have been red.
Yes. And blistered and starting to get those nasty, cracky lips. Like I'm a very pale person. I get sunburned very easily. I understand it. And I mean, Tucker has those blue eyes and they both had sunglasses on and they took them off to play the game. And like, I get it. You're playing the game. You're going to be running around. But how do you even see without squinting? Like, I just want to go put your sunglasses and your sunscreen on and then go back to play. But that's the mom in me. Right
yes.
there.
And also like, where's your water? Like,
yes,
hydrating.
Yeah, can you think about how different this episode might have played out if they had been guzzling water during the game and been fully hydrated before they went in the basement and started their trek?
Exactly. Yes. Would have played out very differently.
Well, that seems to lead us right into then when the Tarathans call T'Pol and say what they feel about Zobral and his friends, and the truth coming out about why Zobral has asked him there and the myth of Archer. So what did you think about this twist in the plot?
It was an interesting twist. Honestly, like it was, to me, it was a callback almost to the TNG episode Attached. It kind of reminded me of when they were going to half of the Kesprit planet wanted to become part of the Federation, and then the other part, I think it was the Prit who didn't want to join. They were like, "What are you doing?" Like, you know, they were contacting the ship and saying that they were just mad that they were working with that the other part of the planet was working with them, and that they were concerned about safety, security, stuff like that. So, but this just reminded me of that a little bit, where they are in contact with a planet, but there are two different people on the planet who are not happy, you know, who are opposing forces. So that kind of puts Enterprise in a weird position. So it made me think of that. And it definitely wasn't a twist. I didn't see it coming, but I wasn't surprised by it either.
Yeah.
Because it did just seem that it was almost too good to be true. You know, this person invites you down and gives you all this food, and you have this like really fun game in the desert. And, you know, in the back of my head, anyway, I'm thinking like, okay, what's going on? You know?
Yeah, we're not watching a 45-minute episode that's dinner and a board game. You know, that's not what they're making an episode of.
Exactly.
But I thought it was very interesting because, as we were speaking about before, we don't see any female Tarathans in this whole episode. And when the Chancellor calls Enterprise, he gets T'Pol, and he doesn't seem fazed by it. He doesn't seem, you know, surprised that he's talking to somebody female or even talking to a different species. So obviously some of that has gone on with them before, or there's other dynamics here we're not aware of. But I think T'Pol's reaction is so classic T'Pol and so interesting. She's getting the maximum amount of information. Mm-hmm. She's doing everything she can to make sure that her crew people are safe. And then she's checking in with the captain and going, hey, you know, I'm glad you're having a good time, but let's be smart about this. Mm-hmm. It's just a very classic T'Pol move. And it's one of those things that at the beginning of the season, I think she would have handled things and said things very differently. But because she's grown with this crew and been with them for almost a year now, she understands how to work on when she's back on the ship, that side, and how to let Archer know that, no, you really might want to get out of this situation without having to flat out say it. And that's some cool character growth there.
I think so. And I appreciate too that he actually listened to her.
Yes.
What was the episode earlier in the season when they went down to the planet and they told the ghost stories and stuff? And
oh, yeah. Strange New World.
Yeah. And where she was saying, you should not beam down. You shouldn't beam down. You shouldn't beam down. And they weren't listening to her, even though her species had experience being out in space, and humans didn't have that kind of experience. So I like that Archer listened. You know, at first he was like, are you sure? But he listened to her. And I appreciated that he actually took her seriously this time and considered what she was saying. So I liked that.
Well, and then we get the truth coming out from Zobral about why he invited Archer. And one of my favorite parts of this episode is this myth of Archer and the Enterprise that's obviously circulating around this part of space these days since they've freed the Suliban and detained. What an interesting little connection. And this was post DS9, so we know that there was a little bit more serialization in Trek, but still not a huge amount. They wanted this in syndication. I mean, this was out there to be episodic, and to have a callback like that is a really nice thread that they keep pulling throughout this whole season with the Suliban. And how interesting to see that, you know, hundreds of years in the future, gossip and the game of telephone still keeps going.
Yes.
And is still just as inaccurate as it is these days.
So true. So true.
But interesting that what came from all these stories about Archer and the crew is the positive, that he's an explorer, he's a warrior, he's out there to help and to fight for good and to make the universe a better place. And of course, if you hear about somebody like this and you're in a situation like Zobral, why would you not reach out? Whether your cause is something that he's going to fight for or not, it is sure worth a try when you're at a point where he's at in his conflict. So I don't blame him at all for thinking, of course, I'm going to get Archer down here and show him that our cause is worth it. Didn't really work, but good try.
Yeah, I agree. Do you think that the way I feel like I didn't get enough backstory to really say, yes, I think the cause was worth it. I don't know. It's interesting to think, like, in some episodes of Star Trek, you see, with similar situations and on other planets where the crew or the ship might want to get involved with a conflict, but they can't because of the Prime Directive. But I couldn't really tell, like, is this something that they would have wanted to get involved? Like, I don't know. I didn't feel very strongly about it, I guess. What did you think?
Well, I think at the end, when Archer says his cause might have been worth it, that he definitely had a positive enough experience that he thought it was worth looking into. I feel like this episode was a little choppy and light on some of that. And I almost would have taken out half of the slow motion shots of the game to put in a little bit more explanation of more than just this was the robes we had to wear and all that. Because it kind of feels almost like an Arab oppression story and a Holocaust story and a sci-fi story and a Civil War story all kind of smushed, but you don't get all those details. But again, Enterprise lives in the gray. And that's one of the reasons I like Enterprise. And I like the fact that things are often morally ambiguous and left that way. So and I like that they're setting up, this is why. Here's another moment that Archer's going, I need a rule. I need a directive. I need something that's a policy that's going to tell me when we should and shouldn't get involved. And it is interesting because I would have liked to have seen this had it been like a streaming show like we have now and had 5 more minutes. I think it could have made this story feel like it flowed a little more and we would have a little more sympathy for Zobral and his gang.
Yeah, that's a good point, though. It's interesting to see the beginning of the Federation and the situations they came up with that led them to creating the Prime Directive. And this could definitely be one of them.
Well, Hoshi and T'Pol are standing there, and when they have that talk about getting involved in things and about why was first contact, where first contact was, and it's a little bonk on the head. I mean, they're using that word directive again. It's the second time that Enterprise has been like, hey, we're talking about the Prime Directive. Are you noticing? We're talking about the Prime Directive right here. We just said the word directive. And a few times I just roll my eyes and go, oh man, they were trying so hard. But they were trying so hard because they were trying to show you why this was important and the mistakes or the ambiguous times that made something be necessary to have in place. And I appreciate that.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so let's talk about this trek across the desert. First of all, we would be amiss if we didn't mention that overall, this soundtrack is great. And when they were playing the game, we heard the Trek Ranks music. So bravo to our friend Jim Morehouse at Enterprise Extra and at Trek Ranks, because that music will never not be Trek Ranks music.
It will not.
But I really noticed the soundtrack in these long desert stretches because there's time without dialogue, and I felt like the music really enhanced these scenes and made them feel hot, even though it was not hot where I was watching it. The music made you feel that exhaustion and that heat and that pressure of that just sweltering everywhere. Yeah. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I had that feeling too. The music in this episode was really good, I thought. Very, very good. I was laughing a little when you mentioned the desert scene because it made me think of Spaceballs.
Yes, every time.
And there's a Star Trek connection with that too, because Tim Russ has a small part in that. So yeah, it was interesting. The music was great, and you could really see how uncomfortable and tired they were getting as they continued on. And I felt bad for them. I'm like, I'm glad it's not me.
Yeah. Well, especially when they get completely submerged in the sand so that the Tarathans going by in the shuttle don't see them. And they come up and the sand is like pouring out of their ears and it's stuck in their eyebrows. And I'm just like, oh, they're so itchy and they're so sweaty and it's so stuck everywhere.
Oh, yes.
But, as you said before, these actors did a great job. So whether or not they were actually hot and sweaty, they sure looked and played hot and sweaty really well. And as someone who's a lot like Trip and doesn't do fantastically well in hot, dry moments and has had some moments and brushes with some heat exhaustion. It's not good when you start getting cold and you're not thirsty. And he played that so well, and you get so spacey. And what an interesting thing to me that they stop at the shuttle, which I appreciate. Like, if you're going to go running across the desert, yes, please stop and get supplies. But there were only 2 bags of water in that whole shuttle. Like, I would hope that they would have more than 2 bags of water in there. And I would have also taken a med kit. Just saying, that would have been me. It would have been worth the carry. Like, let's have something that can help us out just in case. So I always think about that. Like, I know there were bombings, you were in a rush, but you could have grabbed a med kit. That seems like that might have made sense before you go on it.
Yeah, you'd think so. I mean, maybe they didn't want to have to carry a lot of things, but you'd think a med kit would be good at least.
Exactly.
Especially in a desert planet. And after they'd done their survival training in the outback, like, you'd think they'd know to maybe be a little more prepared than...
I know, because they keep referring to it. And Archer remembered enough to spot the abandoned place on the way in. So, I mean, he gets gold star for that. But, I mean, maybe this is, again, just me being a mom going, you always have a Band-Aid with you. And, you always have that emergency stuff. So that's what I would have done. But again, these scenes, they feel long, even though they're not. And that's talent. And that's part of the direction. You get those wide shots that zoom in. You're getting the close-ups of them. And the way that they react to each other, Archer and Trip, in this. And when Archer's telling him, you take this water, I'm going to knock you on your ass and pour it down your throat. That's their relationship right there, though. Like, and it's I'm being harsh with you because I care about you this much. So do it. And Trip knows he's serious. He would do that to take care of him if he had to. And I like seeing that. And Trip is going to push himself till the very last minute when he can't. But when he's saying, can we take a 20-minute break? Can we take a 10-minute break? And then Archer finally turns around and goes, oh, okay, you really mean it. And that's the small nuances of a good friendship. And I appreciated seeing that throughout these scenes.
Yeah, I did too. I liked seeing their relationship in this episode a lot. Like, we've been talking about the friendship between them, and then also their professional relationship as well. So I really enjoyed that.
Well, and meanwhile, they're trekking across the desert, and Reed and T'Pol are up there schooling Zabral on what's really going on with Archer. And one of the moments that I have to point out here, before they even mount the rescue, they let him on the ship. T'Pol realizes, okay, let's let this guy on. And then when they're talking about Archer, both Reed and T'Pol are so respectful of him and so complimentary. He is a great man. He is a great starship captain. He is so ethical, but he's not, it's this superhero figure, this glorious warrior, this paradigm of virtue. He's just a person like everybody else. And to see Zabral react to that and realize that this isn't, the knight in shining armor that he thought it was really well done. And the respect level didn't go down at all. It was just, you could almost see Zabral's shoulders just deflate. And then we're cutting back to Trip and Archer in, going across the desert and getting to the shelter. And you're seeing this great captain doing the things they're talking about. That was really well done. It was really nicely paralleled to me.
I thought so too. Yeah. This just made me think of the episode. There's a TNG episode with a similar thing with the captain. It was the Who Watches the Watchers, where they thought Picard was great. It obviously very, very different story, but when these people on other planets think that, the leader is great, but then you find out, the rumors are not true. Although, again, Who Watches the Watchers is a very, very different case. If you haven't seen it, go watch it, everyone. It's a great episode.
Agreed. But yeah, this does feel like another one of those times where you're going, oh, this is a little bit like this and a little bit like that and a little bit like this. And it is one of the things that makes this episode feel like I said, like it needed about 5 more minutes to be able to really feel like it had the continuity that some of these other episodes we're calling back to had in them. But there are many good chunks within. They just are a little choppy.
Yes, choppy is a good word. I think it's a choppy episode.
Well, then let's talk about when Trip and Archer are in that shelter and when they get rescued, because there's a lot of good things that go down in this part of the episode. What did you think?
I liked this part of just, him, Archer trying to keep Trip going and getting him to talk and not fall asleep and like getting him to think of food. And I thought that was, kind of funny because they love food so much in this show. And it was making me hungry, just all the things that Trip was mentioning.
Well, and I appreciated that the things he mentioned are all things that we have seen or heard them eat previously. So we know that they could actually happen. This could be his dream meal on Enterprise because Chef has made all this stuff for him before. And that's just a nice little bit of continuity in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I liked that a lot. I liked Archer's dedication to Trip was really great. And it's a very different feeling with Trip than he was in Shuttle Pod 1, where in Shuttle Pod 1, he was the optimistic one, we'll get through, let's tough it out. And in this one, well, it's not that he wasn't optimistic in this one, but it seemed like he kind of succumbed to the heat and the planet much faster than Archer did. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And I think sometimes in these episodes where characters, like one or like two or more of them are on a planet, then usually there's one person who goes down a lot faster than the other ones. And I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it made me think back to Vox Sola that we just did when we had Trip and Archer again stuck in the goo monster. And Trip was the one who started freaking out first. And Archer's using the telepathic link to calm him down. And I'm like, I wonder if he's taking some of that from when they were connected and knowing exactly what could keep him going a little bit longer here. But yeah, I always wondered to myself, Trip is from Florida.
Yeah.
So one would think he'd be used to the heat. Now, I know Florida is not a dry heat. And that little throwaway line that they do when they first land on the planet, it's a dry heat. That cracks me up because I don't care. It's still really hot.
Right.
But you'd think he'd have a little bit more. And wouldn't it have been interesting if they had reversed the roles on the planet and it had been Archer who had been the one succumbing to the heat and Trip who was pulling him through it all? It could have been very interesting. And for Zabral to see that when they got on the ship and to see, here's Archer. He made it, but he's not doing well in this desert. So I've always thought about that when I get to this part. And I also wonder at this part, and this is just me, always wondering about the actual, how the ship runs. So Archer's on the planet, Trip's on the planet, Malcolm and T'Pol come and rescue them. Who's in charge on the ship?
Right, yeah.
Like, is it Travis again? Because he's answered some hails sometimes. Is it a random somebody? I mean, Phlox isn't even in this episode. Is he hanging out on the bridge when we aren't there?
Oh, there was no Phlox. Oh my gosh.
There was reference to Phlox, but no Phlox, and it just makes me think of John Billingsley going, "Yep, checks still come whether or not I'm in there." But yeah, it's a nice moment between them in the shelter, and when they have to get up and run again, I mean, Trip finds that inner strength. He does it. He gets himself up and out, and thank goodness they got rescued when they did. And the actual rescue itself. Bravo to T'Pol for figuring out that where all the fire was suddenly changing to is where they should be going.
Mm-hmm.
And I really liked that it was Zabral who put the hand out to get Archer into the shuttle. And that little moment, there's that tiny little pause before Archer grabs his hand. And Zabral just kind of gives him like a half a nod, like, yep, I'm here. I'm getting you. We're getting you out of this mess. And that was a nice little unspoken moment there that I wanted to highlight.
Yeah, I liked that too. And it's too bad. Like, I think it would have been cool to see Zabral again and maybe get like more of his backstory and more of, I think he would have been a fun character to see again.
I agree. And I always wonder with some of these Enterprise episodes, what happened next to these planets that we've only seen once. And maybe we'll find out. Maybe Strange New Worlds or Discoveries going back. I mean, we revisit the aliens from Civilization 900 years in the future and see, their Lolobi orbs in Discovery. So it could happen. Mm-hmm. And I do not know if Clancy Brown is still acting or even still with us, but I wouldn't mind, Captain Pike showing up at this planet and talking to Chancellor Zabral.
Oh, that would be so amazing. That would be so cool. I'm pretty sure he is still alive because I was looking at his wiki and I think he is still alive.
Well, then, somebody write this one. We would love it. It would be fun. Desert planet.
Yes. Oh, that'd be so cool.
Well, let's wrap up then by talking about how they say goodbye at the end of the episode. And Zabral's final little moment and that conversation after he leaves. What were your thoughts on how they left it?
One of the things that jumped out to me, especially at the end, is when T'Pol and Trip are talking and Archer says that he thinks that Zabral might have had a cause worth fighting for. I thought that was interesting. You could really kind of see, like, I think he and Zabral like genuinely hit it off. Like, in the beginning, I kind of thought, okay, this guy's being a little deceitful, but I think that the rapport between them was very genuine. I don't think there was anything fake there. And I think that's another reason why I would have liked to have seen more of him. They seemed to have a good connection. And yeah, it was interesting to think about that. And would it have been a worthy cause? And what would have happened if they'd stayed around? It was an episode that did sort of make you think.
Yeah, and I appreciated that they'd had this final scene, because it could have just been, they rescued them and then we see them later waving goodbye to Zabral on the ship, or, they're rescued and then we see the shuttle fly off and that's the end of it. There have been episodes of many different series of Star Trek that have ended like that. But this one, I like that they had the conversation, and that T'Pol was gracious and confirmed that she agreed with what Archer had done, and Archer being honest and open enough with her at this point in the series that he says, yeah, but it doesn't mean I feel good about it. This isn't like a, yay, we made a great first contact. We made a first contact with someone we had a connection with, and it still feels kind of icky. And, that was an interesting way to leave it. And I appreciated that.
Mm-hmm. I really liked that exchange between them. And it's another moment that you really see how much their relationship has grown, their trust has grown, and their respect has grown for each other. And T'Pol's not scolding him, and he's, they're not being hostile with each other. They're having a very honest and respectful and a conversation, and an important one, I think. So yeah, I liked that a lot.
All right, we have come to the part of the episode where we get to pick our very favorite moment or aspect of the episode, our Porthos pick. So, Kerry, what was the shining moment in this episode for you?
The shining moment for me was when Trip and Archer were playing the geography game, where that was when Archer was trying to keep Trip awake and lively. And after they talked about what they were going to have, what he would want to have for dinner, they played the geography game. And that's where you name a place like, I remember they mentioned Rhode Island. I don't remember the other places they mentioned, but when you name a place and then whatever the last letter of that place is, that the other person has to name a place that starts with that letter. So with Rhode Island, the person would have to do a D place. And I thought it was funny how they were naming alien planets and then places on Earth. And I don't know, I love games like that. And who hasn't played something like that on a card game? So on our card trip, I mean. So yeah, I appreciated that. I like seeing those little moments on Star Trek where people have those, I don't want to say fun because it was really not fun what they were dealing with, but as someone who was watching the show, it was fun as an audience.
Yeah, I agree. That was a really fun moment. And I've also played this game. And I think it's nice that you're seeing Archer. He's racking his brains. He's trying for something that's going to keep Trip engaged and going. And even when they have the good-natured argument about if Xanadu is really a place or not.
Yes.
I think that's what he was going for. Something that was going to make Trip have a reaction enough to keep him awake. And one of the things I like best about this moment is Archer's voice when he's talking to Trip in this. Trip is in bad shape and he's not understanding. Like, he's like, we're going to Rhode Island. And Archer's like, no, we're playing a game. And this is that calm, nurturing voice that you use with someone that you really care about when they're in a bad situation and you're just trying to help it be better. And you want to look at them and be like, no, we're not going to Rhode Island. We're dying on a desert planet. Come on now. But you're keeping it calm and still and chill. And it was gentle. And it was a gentle moment between them. And I really appreciated that because you saw how much Archer really cared about Trip with what he was doing there and how he was doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we see Archer doing that in a lot of other episodes. He was so calm, just through the whole, just very calm and level-headed the whole time. And I liked seeing that.
Well, my Porthos pick for this episode is a little bit more nebulous, but I have to say that I really enjoyed this episode does not place any judgment on Zabral, positively or negatively. It's not portraying him as a hero or a terrorist. It just leaves him in the gray. And And while I said I really would have liked more of the backstory, I really do like that they left it as this is how a real world situation is. It is sticky. It is multi-layered. It's hard to feel like you handled it correctly. And even if I had known, 10 more minutes of how it went, the ending where they left it there, I did appreciate that.
That's a really excellent point. I totally agree.
Accessing library computer data.
All right. So here on the First Flight Pod, we like to do a little bit of trivia as well to give you some background information on the episode that you might not have known before. So, Kerry, what have you dug up for us that's an interesting bit of trivia?
One bit of trivia I dug up, I didn't realize I was listening to the podcast Trek in Time. Mm-hmm. And I learned that this aired the same day as Fallen Hero. So they both aired on May 8th, 2002. And Fallen Hero had 5 million viewers, and this episode only had 4.6 million. Oh. So I don't know if people were going to bed or what the deal was, but it had a bit of a drop in viewership. So it's interesting to think about, how we change how we consume media now. A lot of people are watching things streaming so they can just watch one after another. But back then you couldn't do that. So it's interesting that there was such a drop off between the two episodes. It's really strange, actually.
That is strange because I remember that happening and being super excited about it when it was like 2 episodes next week. Woohoo! And I didn't turn it off at all. I mean, I watched through the commercials because that's what you did back then. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, but this is also prime baseball season. And as someone whose Enterprise got preempted by baseball all the time, I'm wondering if that wasn't the reason behind it and the reason for the drop off.
Maybe. Wait a minute.
Interesting bit of trivia though. Mm-hmm. Mine, I also found super interesting is that we were talking about that game of geography that they played. And that scene was originally supposed to be in the episode Fight or Flight, but it was deleted. And it was when Archer and Mayweather were playing it as they walked down a corridor, and they had to cut it, but they liked the idea of it so much that they reworked it and put it back in this episode. And one more thing to add to that while we were going back to that scene is I know that the lighting in there was gorgeous, and you had something you wanted to say about the lighting when they first came out from that scene, right?
Yeah, when they came up from the bunker scene where they heard the bombing and they came up, and the lighting was so amazing. They're in the desert at night and there's fire, and I thought that was really well shot.
Yeah, I'm glad that they put this scene in this episode as opposed to Fight or Flight, because I think it really fit in better here than it could have there.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Transfer of data is complete.
All right, so we have come to the part where we have to wrap up our final thoughts and ratings. We are going into our grapplers. On a scale of 1 to 10, what are your final thoughts and rating on Desert Crossing, Kerry?
Oh, I'm kind of torn on this one. Like, there's some things I really like about it. I also, like I've mentioned, I feel like it's kind of choppy. I don't think it's a bad episode. I don't think it's a great one. So I think I'd say like a 6.5 or 7 in that area. Like, it's a good episode. I'll go with 6.5.
Well, we're on a very similar wavelength because I went back and forth between a 6.5 and 7 and finally settled on the 7 because while I felt like this was a very hyper masculine episode that didn't age as well as it wanted to, the more that I thought about it, the more I really appreciated some of the other aspects that they put in there. So it bumped it up to that full 7 for me. But I agree, this one after the last couple that we've had that have been so fantastic, and knowing what's coming up with the trip to Risa and the season finale, it's a little bit of a dip in this end of season, but it's still a good solid episode with some really fine points in it.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And the Zobral, I thought his character really brought it up to me. I just thought he was so well played and so interesting. And yes, I hope we do see him in Strange New Worlds. That would be amazing.
We're going to manifest it.
Mm-hmm.
My chronometer's running backwards.
Incoming transmission.
You read my letter?
All right. Now it's time for Daniels to send us back in the timeline and give us some communications that we have gotten from our awesome First Flight community on all of our social media. So tonight our comms are about our episode Vox Sola, which I know Kerry has a special place in her heart for.
Oh, yes.
And this one is from Ensign Rick on Twitter, and he's at Guy Lonely, but the O in Lonely is a 0. And he said, I was rewatching it not too long ago and very surprised at how good an episode it was. Enterprise had a lot of episodes that were different because the crew looked at things more like we would today. They only had the Vulcan database for past experience. And I like that. Thank you very much, Ensign Rick, for throwing that out there. I think you're right that Enterprise has that different viewpoint that really is nice to see. And no matter what your feelings on that episode, that is something that is 100% true.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's a good episode.
And if you would like to continue the discussion with us or share your Porthos picks or Grappler ratings or thoughts, you can reach us at First Flight Pod on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And Kerry, thank you again so very much for joining me today as our fabulous guest host. It was absolutely delightful to talk about this episode with you. And what's the best way to reach you, and where else can we hear you?
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. It was so fun. It's great to talk about Enterprise. And you can find me on Twitter. It's KerrBearLib, KerrBearLib. And if you are a Muppets fan, I do a podcast with my husband, Justin, called Muppet Profiles. Abby has been a guest. We're going to be releasing an episode with you, hopefully sometime in the coming weeks. It's a tribute to Emilio Delgado, who played Luis on Sesame Street. So definitely check that out. And you can find us on most places where you get your podcasts. And we're on Twitter and Tumblr now, and also on Instagram. And we're also on Tenor, if you'd like to see Muppet GIFs or GIFs, however you call them. And it's all Muppet profiles for all of them. So yeah, definitely check us out.
Wonderful. And I can't second enough about how great Muppet Profiles is as a podcast. It's so much fun. It's fun to be on. It's fun to listen to. And Kerry makes the best GIFs, however you call them, of Muppets out there. So I feel free to check that out. I strongly recommend it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And if you want to get a hold of me, the best place to find me is on Twitter at Abby M. Sommer. That's SOMMER. And if you want to get Melanie, our usual co-host, she's at ShuttlePod2 on Twitter. We want to thank you for spending this time with us. We'll be back next time with the long-awaited trip to Risa in 2 days and 2 nights, the penultimate episode of Season 1 of Enterprise. And as always, we leave you with this quote from Jonathan Archer and your moment of Melanie for this episode.
The most profound discoveries are not necessarily beyond that next star. They're within us, woven into the threads that bind us, all of us, to each other.